I have always had the love for assemblage, but I didn't think of myself as being any kind of a sculptor. And I started to move into using found objects and just fell in love. In terms of media, it's just all over the place because found objects can take you any place, right? I use metal, I use fabric, plastic, I fabricate things, I sew things. My childhood was my mother sewing and, at the dining room table with those scissors along the wooden tabletop cutting fabric. I think I've always wanted to make work that it had to say something that was really important to me. And of course that has changed over time, but one of the really big shifts in my work came, my older daughter struggles with debilitating depression and anxiety, and art became my therapy. I was so angry that no one talked about mental illness. And so it was very isolating, and I was not going to accept that. So I started making work about it. Because I incorporate so many found objects, I'm constantly looking for this next interesting thing. I had started to make work about gun violence because it was something that had affected my family. And it was certainly rampant, as we all know, in this country. But because it had touched me personally, I really felt the need to do something. So I started looking for inspiration from objects that were out in the world. What could I use? And one of the things that I found was a belt buckle that I then made a mold of and cast to make these guns, to make this particular piece called American Roulette. And from that, I found something called the primer, which I didn't know what a primer was. And it's the little teeny piece on a shell casing. By themselves in a container just look like sequins. That's one of the things I love about found objects is that we ascribe meaning to them and they also hold memory. And so I really get to play with that. I've done a lot with the American flag because, of course, people feel very strongly about this symbol of our country, and that it's this symbol of all the things that we're supposed to be about. And of course, we're not really about those things. We pretend we are, we hope we are, we want to be about those things. But when you talk about liberty and justice for all, that has never been the case. One of the things that I've done repeatedly with the US flag is I've removed the color from it. You still recognize it as a US flag, but I've removed the patriotism of it, right? I had a large installation called The Greatest Show on Earth when I used 50 US flags and I made a giant circus tent. I make the work because I have to make the work. So that doesn't go away, whether someone's gonna see it or not. I ultimately am making it for me, to work through these ideas, to help me make sense of the world.
I would probably say I'm a writer who went to art school. There is spiritually knowing you're an artist, and then also like the art industry are two different things for me. I use portraiture to talk about communities that claim me and that I belong to. I would say I'm still intimidated by the tools of photography. I've never been formally trained. If you look at the body of work when I'm working in photo and video, it's really just me learning. It's me always being confident that I'm a storyteller. Like, I'm gonna tell the story. But it's also me just figuring things out. When I think about Black image making, I really appreciate Black documentarians. And at the same time, I would say, as a younger artist, someone like Isaac Julian or Julie Dash, there's a way that they're going about image making that is stylized and aestheticized, but also has a deep reverence for the subjects that they're depicting. For me, I didn't want to go about trying to have conversations around abolition or gentrification and displacement in a verite kind of way. Instead, I do it maybe in a way that's, I don't know if it's unexpected, but for me it works, and it's a little bit more dreamy. The writer in me is really practical, and I would say you can't do what you can't imagine. And I think we go to dream spaces to transform our reality. So like things that are a little bit softer. Being a documentarian has a hardness to it that I'm not always interested in, so I like softer things. Some of the projects that I'm doing now are around what are the ways that we can heal the land? And it's with a lot of intentionality around how do Native, Black, and Brown people, all of us have histories with colonization. What are we gonna do? I have a mentor named HQ, and her academic name is HLT Kwan. And she would always tell me, Davida, it's much easier to destroy things than it is to create. So I'm an abolitionist, and so on one level, it's good to talk about getting rid of prison systems, but on the other hand, what are we creating? So I can't come to your house and say, your house is fucked up, let's tear it down, if I don't have blueprints, if I don't have things to imagine around, like what is the new space that you get to live in that functions on a level that is harmonizing.
I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, and so wood carving has been part of the history of this area since, prehistory up till now, really. This process is really akin to my nature in a lot of ways, and I think that being paired with the sort of choreographic aspect of growing up in dance too, I can come here and I know what the choreography is. I think growing up in the Hood Canal area and being around chainsaw carving, woodworking really influenced me to sort of dive into my roots in a way that I wasn't with printmaking and explore something that, I consider a folk art medium, but also like a more honest and introspective way of working with material that was around me. Traditional wood carving requires access to space and access to this sort of community, this like wealth of knowledge. Chainsaw carving being more of something that laborers who would have worked were taking this tool and then using it in a different context for pleasure as opposed to for utility. A lot of my work is about that in general, taking the utility out of objects and allowing space for pleasure and joy to sort of take over in the process. My process kind of ebbs and flows between this like more regimented planning of making the sculptures and then also relies really heavily on the installation. When the pieces are being installed on site at a gallery space or performance hall or, outdoors, whatever, they're often accompanied by other objects and materials that sort of allude to the origins of ideas and concepts that I'm interested in working with in the sculptures. And so there's this kind of equal practice of labor and craft, really a labor of love in the process, but also the improvisation of working on site with installation and all of these other materials. I use yellow cedar pretty exclusively. I was working for an artist for a while who is in a period of yellow cedar usage and kind of have developed this like Pavlovian response with the wood where it has a very unique scent. And so the scent smells like the studio to me, and the studio is very much home for me. And I also really like the tactility of this wood specifically because it's very soft. I'm interested in choosing materials for their softness specifically. I've been working with copper more recently too. It's also regionally specific to this area. It's found from southern Alaska all the way down the BC coast. Growing up in a blue-collar environment, I feel like craft is often seen in a negative light in fine arts, quote unquote. And I think that there's something inherently classist about that. I come here to work with craft unabashedly, and I feel like I use my creative practice to spin straw into gold.
I'm always interested in how to acknowledge and talk about my family's history and ties through craft making artwork. A lot of the women I work with in Mexico are artisans, but their technique is looked down upon. So I'm always looking at ways of how to address those gender issues, class issues, how to address Indigenous rights through that whole process as well, and knowledge that keeps getting taken away and then used. And so I'm trying to bring all of those elements back into the work, but also address this perspective of how queer identity is constructed and developed, and these ideas of these mythologies of what that represents. I like using mythological stories that are based around Mayan folklore, but also using Greek and Egyptian, but then also creating my own into a contemporary aspect of what identity is right now and how I'm seeing or feeling myself in the environment that I'm living in. When I'm building out sculptures, a lot of it comes from looking at everyday objects and reinterpreting them and figuring out why it was created and what's the relationship and the purpose and how we function with that object. You know, a lot of civilizations before colonization were very smart, could read and write. So this idea of like how power is constructed and like how power is kept in certain hands only. I look at my Mayan history and how we've had so much of our knowledge destroyed. And for me, it's going back and looking at some of the structures, ceramic pieces, even the functional cupware, ceramic pots and cups and utensils, and how a lot of these would tell stories. Like they weren't used all the time for consuming, but they actually told the story of the object or the material that was being consumed or you know, so when we look at cacao, a lot of it's telling you the story of what it is, not who consumed it. It's telling you who it belonged to and who this person was. I'm really big on storytelling, and the Volkswagen I created, I was trying to talk about the Industrial Revolution and the effects of that in the textile history, and how during this period where everybody talks about innovation and what that means, it was also created during, you know, the 1930s, the Nazi like height of their genocide and power. So I like to look at things like that, and then I like to reinterpret these ideas of like, okay, so if we have certain amounts of knowledge that was still preserved, then how can we create what our identity is now? How can we evolve that to what it could have represented back in the day if we still had all of these pieces and objects that we could use?